Isn't it insensitive to tell people to have joy when they're suffering? Do you think that's insensitive?
Well, that's kind of where we're just talking about that, right? What do you think?
But is it insensitive? I mean, yes, it could be insensitive. I think it depends on the situation. I feel like, something I think just what John said, time is probably a little bit of the determining factor of that, because I've always heard it said, and this is one of my favorite illustrations, that it's kind of like pain and suffering in life sometimes is like sitting in front of a railroad tracks watching a train go by. Is it you just see the cars in front of you, you don't see the beginning or the end, so you have no idea how long it's going to last. But if you could get in a helicopter and look over above, you could see the whole situation, and then once it's passed, you can better understand the whole situation. So sometimes time helps heal the wounds a little bit, and sometimes time helps us to better understand the situation.
I think there's also this element of joy is very much Christian joy that comes from the Lord, right? A lot of it actually has to do with our trust in God. Yeah. And so the idea, because how can the same scripture, the same Bible that says, count it to joy, my brothers, when you go through various trials, also tells us to mourn with those who mourn, that there is a season for mourning and a season for weeping. How can those two things exist? It's because joy and mourning are not completely opposite of each other. Joy is, just speaking from my experience, like me and Becca went through a really hard thing a few years ago, and there was a lot of mourning and a lot of sorrow in that, but we never once lost the joy of the Lord, which was that we trusted that through the situation somehow there would be God would be glorified somehow through that, right? And even in those moments where it didn't make sense, we could fall back into that trust of this. And even though it stunk, it wasn't like, it was like, oh yeah, I get to go through this today. This is great. No, it still stunk, and there were still awful moments. And I mean, there were days with weeping, but the joy of the Lord is something that kind of still was present through all that. And so I think there is this hard thing where we like to think of joy as just be happy. So like, if you go to someone who's suffering and you say, hey, just smile, just find joy, and dismiss the struggle and dismiss the challenge, that's very insensitive. Mm-hmm. But there is a way to say, hey, you are suffering, but here's the hope that God offers through this. Here is what you can, in this hard time, lean into. And it doesn't make the stinky parts of life any less bad. Yeah. It just helps you carry through those things to get to that place where on the other side you can look back and say, I saw God all these different ways.
Yeah. And sorry if I
No, go ahead.
Okay, so and also I've been in situations where I've had a phone call about someone going through something really tough situation, and at the time it felt more appropriate to say, well, maybe there's a lesson to be learned from this. Maybe there's you don't know what God is going to teach you through this moment, so there's joy in this suffering because God is going to use this for something good in your life. Mm-hmm. So I think it's somewhat kind of like depends on the situation. If it's an instance like what John was talking about, because I know his story and his life, I wouldn't go to him at that moment and be like, John, you need to be joyful in this. No, I would be like, that stinks right now. I'm your friend. How can I would love to be able to help you, in some way, because I have a relationship with you and I'm friends with you and I knew the situation. But later in life, we could sit down and be like, look back at that situation and talk about how God saw you through that and the positives that come out of it, and then the help and comfort you can give to someone else that may go through the same thing that you faced.
And it's crazy too. Like Becca and I have conversations regularly now where we talk about how like in those moments we didn't see the future. It just seemed bleak. But today we look back and say, wow, it's really cool how that worked. It's really cool that it played out the way it played out. In the moment, we couldn't see that. We just had to trust God was working something out, right? But now I get to look back, and what's changed is it actually emboldens our faith to continue to, when God brings you through something challenging, it's a lot easier to go into the next challenging thing because your confidence, faith and confidence are very related. And so your confidence in the Lord is emboldened and increased because of what he's already brought you through.
Yeah.
I think part of the difficulty is when you say, there's a difference between going in and saying to somebody, well, you need to have joy.
Yeah.
Right. Versus pointing them to joy.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say, if someone's having a hard time, it may seem a bit insensitive to just say, well, you should have joy, because that's not very helpful.
Yeah.
But I would say it's unloving to not point them to joy.
Oh, yeah.
So if I were to enter a situation where someone is suffering for whatever reason, I am there to give them joy. That is why I'm there. Yeah. And if I don't point them in that direction, then I'm being unloving. And so I think, we need to be sensitive. We need to be kind. We need to mourn with those who mourn. We need to comfort those who need to be comforted. All of that is true. But in all of that, if we're not pointing them to joy, it's meaningless. It's that the resurrection is the hope of joy.
Yep.
And Paul said, if the resurrection is not true, then we are the most miserable of all. And I think sometimes because we want to, be empathetic and mourn and comfort and all that stuff, we make ourselves more miserable. Like if I go into somebody and they're in this dark spot and they're like, oh, there's no hope. And I say, yeah, I get it. There's no hope. Why even go? Yeah. Right? So I think that we have to figure out how to point them towards joy. But I think that if I have to choose between being perceived as insensitive and being actually unloving, I'm going to choose to be perceived as insensitive so that I can be truly loving, which is I'll point to joy even if maybe they don't want that. Because there are times when people want to wallow in the mud.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And the worst thing I can do is say, yeah, that mud is beautiful. Keep wallowing.
Well, and sometimes it changes too, like dealing with Christians who are going through a hard thing, and it's I think a lot easier than that to be like, I know that you may not feel it right now and see it in the immediate of your life, but I know about this future hope. I know versus dealing with somebody who is in that place where it's life is awful. I don't believe in a God, but maybe I do a little bit. So how can God let this happen to me? In that person, that's a much different conversation, and that person has never even received maybe the spark of that hope.
Right. Yeah. As Paul said in 1 Thessalonians, we do not mourn as those who have no hope.
Yep.
Right.
So nothing is more frustrating than when Christians mourn as those who have no hope.
It's hard too. Sometimes people are mourning about things that they could, there is things, just horrible things that happen to people, right? But sometimes the things that we are upset about and that are making our lives miserable are the results and the consequences of our own behaviors and our own actions. And that's the worst thing I could ever do is to encourage your mourning for something that you have the power to fix and improve in your life.
Yeah.
Well, we also, as humans, tend to, when things aren't going our way, or we see other people who have more than we have, it's easy to be a little bit of a Debbie Downer of like, oh, if I only had this, or if I, so I think it's, in the sense, it's easy to be someone who sees bad things when they aren't necessarily there. It's maybe the human condition that we live in. So, I think we have to regularly remind ourselves of all the good thing that God does. And David, I think you do a good job with this of being thankful, just talking about being grateful for the things that we have. And being grateful is the antidote for being ungrateful, and I think that helps put our lives in perspective when we're like, hey, I actually have a lot of things to be thankful. And when things feel really bad and I start counting all the ways that God has blessed me, it helps. It's
crazy how much gratitude I have for the concept of gratitude, because it changes your perspective in every area of your life. And, I think that's why you bring it up so often, is because if this is the one thing you can begin to practice, I think more than almost any other practice, you will start to see your attitude and your perspective change rapidly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can say with like 99% confidence that the most miserable people I know across the board are the ones who are not grateful for anything. Mm-hmm. Yep. And the more grateful people are, the more joy they exhibit. And, you look at the two joy and suffering passages that are the most common in the Bible are James 1 and Philippians 4, right? And look at the key word in both of those is either every or all.
Yeah.
Right. I've learned to be content in what situations?
All situations.
Right. And I, count it joy when you endure what kind of trials and tribulations?
Yeah.
All.
Yeah.
So I just think, there it is. And no matter where you're at, gratitude.
Yeah. Those are great verses when you're going through a tough time, Definitely.